I still got through 43, 44 different consecutive weeks of going to the gym.
Oh, damn, that's pretty good. Our man Don here has like a 3-year record. He's been going.
I don't know about that. Not lately. Not lately. From the Spec Network, this is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show. This episode of Fragmented is brought to you by BuddyBuild. A key component to building a successful software is, well, of course, engaging end users throughout the entire development process. Now, BuddyBuild is a mobile-optimized continuous integration and delivery platform that was built specifically to help developers engage their end users. Thousands of mobile development teams already love BuddyBuild because it's one of the fastest ways to build, run tests, and distribute Android and iOS applications to their users. Using BuddyBuild's SDK, you can gather feedback, crash reports, and important device metadata from users in real time. You can then use these cool special built-in integrations that BuddyBuild has for various different bug trackers and chat tools like Slack to seamlessly integrate that same data back into your development process so you can get notified whenever is convenient. BuddyBuild also provides developers with the perfect insight into certain bugs and helps enable you to help iterate faster on your application than ever. In the end, they're trying to make sure that you're building an app that you know your users will love. Join thousands of developers who've already added BuddyBuild to their development process. Try it free today at fragmentedpodcast.com/BuddyBuild. Again, that's fragmentedpodcast.com/BuddyBuild. Thanks again, BuddyBuild. Okay, Kaushik, here we are again, round 2. So let's hop right into it, folks. Today we're going to be talking about some fun stuff here in regards to UX, UI, and so forth, and everything around that area. And we have a special guest here. He's also a GDE. Please welcome Raveesh. Welcome to the show, Raveesh.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Now, for the folks that aren't familiar with you or not familiar with your background in Android particularly, could you give us like the Reader's Digest version of kind of how you got into Android and what you're currently doing with Android currently?
Sure. So I got into Android from the development side of things back in 2009 or 2010. It was just starting to take off over here in India itself. I wanted to start writing code for mobile applications, and I first started out with Nokia and then realized that's a big mistake.
Cutting edge stuff there.
Yeah, but that was a big thing in India for a long time. But anyway, so soon enough what I noticed was after building a few applications, I used to spend a lot more of my time actually perfecting the design elements of things, particularly the UX. And slowly, as a result of that, I kind of moved into more of a design role wherever I was. I still write some Android code on the side. I just released an application last month that actually aids my design work, but that's only a hobby now.
Oh, very interesting.
Just joined this design and development agency in India called Uncommon, and on the side, just advising a few more startups.
So you're kind of like the wild unicorn that's out there that, someone who can develop and design?
Yeah, so I actually don't think that they're that rare. I really think that developers have a big role to play in design, and they're already doing that. I think there are a few developers out there that are actually pretty good at design already.
My friend, you overestimate the capability of developers. No, but fair. There are like a whole bunch of developers that we see these days who actually have like pretty, they have pretty good design taste and aesthetic.
So it's not just the design taste, it's also just the role they play. So it may not be actually the visual elements, but there's other sides of the table that they take care of.
And that's actually a great segue. But before we get into that, I had a quick follow-up question from, I think you mentioned. So you said you started off with the Nokia days. So did you actually have to write apps in like the Symbian OS, which is, I believe...
Wow.
Yeah, so I was writing their old, I don't even remember. So they had the Symbian C++. They also had the Qt, the IDE. I think it took forever to just get the hang of it, and I just gave up, and I'm like, you know what, I think I'm just going to write for Android because it's Java.
I mean, what does it say if you actually pick Java as a language over something else, right? You're like, this is like too annoying. I'm just going to go with Java. So, wow, just speak volumes of what it might have been.
Oh, it was awful.
But I mean, following up with again what you mentioned. So you said it isn't just about the visual like design and aesthetic, and I find that fascinating because a bunch of my friends who are designers also mention that. And I mean, obviously, there's always the famous Steve Jobs quote where he says like design isn't necessarily about the visuals; it's about like how it works. I don't recall exactly what it is, but that was a large part of it, right? So could you like touch a little on that topic? Like, what is design? What does like design mean when you consider it, especially as someone who has worked as a developer before? You have like the unique advantage of translating this mystical world to us.
Right. So I think the big thing is that a lot of people confuse design for art. They think the fact that they can't draw or they aren't good with colors, they don't have a role to play in design. I think that's just the visuals are just a part of design itself. I look at design as essentially kind of like the strategy that you're using to solve certain challenges that come your way, right? So I almost consider it like a science personally. Like I believe that good design can actually be measured and you can quantify what's working and what's not working itself. And it's a lot of logic itself, which is why I believe that developers can actually make pretty good designers.
So usually the way I try to think about it is like this difference between UI, which is like a lot of what you said with the art, the illustration, a lot of like what the visuals that you see, and then there's like UX, which is the experience, right? So does like the science aspect that you mentioned play more heavily into UX, or is it like a conjunction? Like, is it something that you can actually easily demarcate?
I think it plays slightly more in the UX side of things. I do think it plays in the UI as well. The point of it is like you're essentially measuring a certain design change, for example, that you make and quantifying that what you wanted the user to be able to do, whether or not they're able to do that in an easier way and using some of the other measuring tools, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you should be like the old... so the UI side of it, like obviously the buttons play an important role, like your choices there play an important role as well. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you should be doing the old Google test, like they did that A/B test with 50 different colors of blue for links, right? So I think that's a little overblown.
Just a tad bit little, yeah. Are there any other misconceptions with respect to design that you think is important to sort of like iron out at this point?
I just think that design needs to be thought of as strategy itself. It needs to be the core of a product team itself. So usually, for example, what would quite happen at most of the startups that I advise, they would have like a product team who would kind of decide upon what needs to be solved and how they're going to solve it. And they go to designers and tell them, okay, we want you to design out the UI for this. I think that the designers need to have a seat at the table at the higher level itself, at the strategy side of things.
So right at the point of like where you're building this like product to begin with, right? So at the stage where like the product managers are doing their whole business evaluation or like the objectives of the application.
Exactly.
Yeah, I completely agree with that statement. In every company, it seems like that I've consulted at, it's, an idea comes down from the product or the higher levels, and then it kind of comes to designers too late in the product lifecycle, and then it kind of feels like you're just applying a coat of paint on top of something just to make it look better. But if design was brought in earlier, they might actually see that, hey, we can actually do this thing a little bit differently, and it's going to make sense to users, a lot more than this typical, wizard flow that you're building or whatever you have. So I think it's great. That's a great idea, and I also completely agree with that statement. We should be bringing designers into the fold a lot easier in these conversations. Now, let's say that you have an app out there, or I have an app, and Kaushik has an app, and so forth. How can you tell by looking at our two apps if an app has a good user experience?
I can't necessarily say that you can tell it immediately, right? So you could probably point out who's done a few things wrong if it's just standing out. I just think good user experience is something that you kind of realize over a period of time, and quite often you don't even really realize it because it just feels so natural that you're not really paying too much attention to it. So a lot of applications, for example, would do a lot of animations and stuff like that just to wow you, but over a period of time, you probably just get tired of it, or maybe it doesn't even have as much of an impact as you might think it does, right?
Do you think that in the Android world today, some folks have gone overboard? I mean, again, I'm like, I don't want this to be a leading question, but one thing that I
Right.
have noticed is with animations and material design, right? Actually, let's not even talk about animation specifically. Material design in general, do you think folks have gone like overboard with the material design, or do you think maybe it's not being used enough? That's like an interesting conversation I've had with quite a few folks. They've always said, hey, material design is like great. And I felt the same thing too. I don't necessarily feel it as being overboard, but then again, I am an Android user, so maybe I'm being biased. So what are your thoughts as like someone who works in design? I imagine you have a slightly more objective outlook towards that.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people tend to get material design wrong, like its complete original goals itself. Um, I think the main things that you need to keep in mind is like you talk to a lot of people and they're like, if we have to do material design, we need to have a floating action button. We need to have a toolbar and stuff like that, right? I don't think that's the way that you need to think of it. You need to go back to its original thought about how what material is supposed to stand for is trying to bridge the divide between digital interfaces and like physical products, right? So taking some of the affordances that we have in physical products and applying them to digital products itself, which is essentially shadows and the way things move, feeling very natural. So as a result of that, I do think a few people get it wrong in the sense that they put a floating action button in a place that it probably doesn't need to be. I think Google also missed a big beat over here. Like the original material guidelines talked about the floating action button as a promoted action. I felt that wording was perfect in the sense that the way it kind of talked about that button itself, for example. But yeah, I also think that a lot of designers tend to feel very constrained by material design, try to think between its own lines. And as a result of that, we might see very very homogeneous design itself, right? So I think some of the good designers try to take steps away from that. They understand that while there are guidelines, they make sense. Like it absolutely makes sense to deviate from the guidelines every now and then.
Gotcha. I mean, and one of the easiest ways to help someone understand what good design is to basically just point them to applications that do this really well, right? Can you like point us to like maybe 4 or 5 applications that you think do this well, or like just have good design in general, not necessarily just material design?
Sure. I think the one that a lot of people would probably used is Todoist. It's a to-do application that I absolutely love. I've tried out a bunch in my life. One of the things that I actually like about it is like if you actually look at it, it feels like a very standard material design application. Where I think it stands out is this little feature of theirs called Karma Points, and the way it essentially promotes you to be a little more active in terms of keeping track of your tasks and marking them off. They have this small indicator which is just pointing up or down in terms of your trends. So it just gamifies getting your tasks done. The other one that I really like is sticking to something that actually changes behavior is actually Foursquare, and specifically Swarm. It's again a little known feature from Swarm itself where they essentially give you like they kind of indicate when you're on a streak. And as a result of this, I saw someone who did a 52-week streak of checking in at a gym. And I've tried to do that this year as much as possible. I got up to about 43, 44 weeks, and then it couldn't go through with that. But I still got through 43, 44 different consecutive weeks of going to the gym.
Oh, damn, that's pretty good. Our man Don here has like a 3-year record. He's been going.
I don't know about that. Not lately. Not lately.
Another one that I just came across is this little app called Enki, which is for it's actually to keep you in like to help improve your programming capabilities. So since I stay out, like I don't write as much code as I should, I kind of try to stay and keep track of some of the best practices out there. And they also have the small little gamification thing on top, which lets you know how many days of the past week have you actually come in and spend 5 minutes on the app going through one of their workflows. Also, the way they kind of position it is they just kind of tell you like all you have to do is spend 5 minutes in the app, and that kind of convinces you that I just won't take that much time out in a single day. The one that I came across recently, doing some of the research here in India, was called Fastfilmz. Um, the the reason I love this is because it's completely different from what you'd expect from a material application itself. So Fastfilmz is a startup based out of South India. They do movie streamings for regional languages over here, like 3 languages in southern India, and they have a completely different UI. So one of the things that I've noticed in my research on the next billion users in India is that nobody here really uses search. So their entire navigation is actually based on movie stars, because that's one of the major reasons people watch movies, because they want to keep track of their favorite stars.
Oh, okay.
And one of the things that they have actually during the stream itself, a couple of buttons on the screen that you can tap to. One of them essentially mimics a whistle for you, and the other actually does some firecrackers all over the screen. And if you've ever been to a South India movie screening in a theater, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Like, people over there kind of go nuts at times with firecrackers and stuff inside. No one cares about the fire codes and all, and they're just replicating that behavior for these people in the phones itself.
I chuckle because I know exactly what you're talking about, like the whole whistling thing. Have you heard of, like, are you used to whistling, Don, like in movies? Is that
no?
something?
All this is like, well, I mean, certain places, like you go to like at certain theaters in New York City, it's going to be a little rowdy, but throughout the majority of the United States, like you go to a movie theater and people may clap when certain things happen, like in a Star Wars movie, but general movies, people just kind of sit there and watch them and you don't hear a single thing. But apparently that's different in India. What is it like over there?
Yep. I mean, it's in certain theaters. I wouldn't say even certain theaters. It's more regional. It's also very dependent on the stars itself. So Bollywood films also have it for Salman Khan, for example, but most of the other movies don't have it. So I've never particularly experienced this. I've just heard of a lot of people having experienced this.
Oh, I mean, so I have. So when back when I was in India, there's this extremely famous movie star called Rajinikanth, right? Who's from South India, and he's like the equivalent of like Chuck Norris here. Like, there are like there are memes about, like, because some of his movies are outright crazy, right? Like, he'll catch bullets and like like, shove them back at you. So, and
that's awesome.
Yeah, and no, people have like almost like a devotion towards him because he's also a good person in real life. So like for his movies, like, even though people know like what they're seeing is like completely bizarre, they'll just like, they go for the experience of just like enjoying it with other folks, right? Like, and revel in the ridiculousness of it all.
Exactly. And it just kind of signifies how they get their user base so well. So you can never expect a Netflix, for example, to do something like this.
Right. That, yeah, oh yeah, for sure. And I think, and it makes sense that Netflix doesn't do it and Fastfilmz does it because it aims at that target demographic, right?
Right.
That brings up the point then. Does that mean, so if you're like this, you're in a startup, it's doing well and you're expanding to different countries, does that mean you tailor your app specifically to every single country that you go to and sort of localize it in some way? And I don't mean like the technical localization that most of us developers are used to. I mean, do you tailor the app to the specific countries that you're moving towards? Or, like, for example, does the Uber app have to be completely different when used in India versus used in China versus used in the US? Like, what are your thoughts there?
I think it makes sense to make that investment at some point or the other when you kind of know this market is becoming important for you. I know, for example, that a bunch of companies are starting to do a lot more research in India to understand the market better itself, now that they've kind of determined that this is where they're going to get the next big growth for their own business from. Facebook has a great post up recently on Medium talking about their suggestions for international research itself. It doesn't need to be completely different, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are a few things here and there that need to be different.
So if we move this forward just a little bit here, if we're wanting to mimic some of these applications that have these good UIs and user experience and so forth, if I want to get to that level, do I need to worry about building a particular team in a certain way to accomplish that? Or if I should I just start with engineers, or should I also try to get a designer first? Or is there any particular way that you advise companies to structure teams to make sure they can nail their
design and UX?
So one of the benefits of the last few years has been that a lot of startups tend to have a design founder right from the get-go. So, and the big benefit of that is that means that design has a significant voice at the strategic level itself. If you don't have that, you, I do think it makes sense to maybe hire a designer if you can afford it. I'm not going to stop you. But having said that, you probably want to, like, the biggest investment you can make early on is research itself. And you don't necessarily have to hire someone else to do it. You probably can pick up at least to a degree of it yourself. I think there's a Steve Krug's book called Rocket Science Made Easy for doing user research yourself that I haven't actually gone through yet myself, but some of the people that I respect share kind of recommend it a lot. And a designer can probably come in a little later. So one of the strategies, for example, that I recommend early is understand your target users, see what kind of applications they're using, and try to keep your design as similar to those applications itself. For example, I was at this startup previously, which was designing a WhatsApp for customer care. And what I essentially did in the early version of the application was essentially almost completely copy WhatsApp's design and behavior, except for just adding a few little things here and there, which I felt polished it a little bit more in terms of typography and other stuff. But largely, it was just the same.
So you said user research is one thing that is pretty helpful early on, right? So how should I go about this, specifically being like an engineer? Because most of our listeners in the end are like developers, and I imagine they're interested in knowing how.
And just real quick to add on to that, in other platforms like in the web, we have things like Bootstrap and Foundation and so forth to kind of kickstart us into like getting a decent design and user experience. Do you know of anything that the developers can rely on that's similar in the Android world?
I think you can rely on the material design guidelines and the support library itself quite a bit right now. It gives you at least the basic stuff right over there. After that, it's going to be largely a case of just going through the guidelines to be aware of it on the Android side of things. If I have to go more to to Kaushik's point, which is essentially about what you should do, what I'm actually going to say is do not get into the rush of getting to code. I would take a step back. I would highly recommend ensuring that you spend time on your designs when they're in Sketch. Create some kind of prototypes for them and test them out in InVision. And that's how you should probably go about it. So there's this little quote from IBM's old research, which talks about how every dollar spent on design and research can save you about $10 in development costs and $100 in post-release maintenance. So highly recommend following that. The process that I would kind of recommend is something called a design sprint that Google talks about quite a bit. So essentially gets you to really understand your users, do a lot of prototyping really quickly, and test it out with users in all of this inside a week so that you know whether or not your design is actually working.
And so can you talk a little about this the sprint thing that Google has, the Google Ventures has come up? So for example, if Don and I were to sit down, right, and say, hey, let's build this thing together, and do it in this with this design sprint integrate into a workflow, what would that look like?
So the sprint methodology kind of talks about how the first day should be spent doing interviews, and ideally you're talking about interviews within your team. If it's just the two of you, you'll have to figure out who else you can do this with. But in this interview, what you're essentially trying to do is creating a user journey map where you kind of take a whiteboard, you put the user on the left side of it and the goal that they're trying to do on the right. And what you're trying to do is draw a map of how they're getting to this goal currently, either through an existing product or a bunch of products or whatever. And in this map, what you'll essentially find is where the pain points are for the user. And the suggestion essentially is to kind of fix those kind of pain points in itself, right? It just shows you the opportunity, illustrates it in front of you. After that, what you essentially do is try to go as wide as possible. You kind of sketch out a bunch of different ways that you can potentially solve it, a bunch of different versions of it. and you're just doing very rough designs yourself using just pen and paper. You're not really touching your laptop yet. Then you share these between the two of you or with the rest of your team. You kind of talk through each thing and you kind of determine what seems to be a positive idea, what seems to be something that may not be as strong, before you essentially create a storyboard on day 3. This is the storyboard that you kind of agree upon, that this is how we're going to go about to solve this problem in itself. Once you have the storyboard, it becomes a lot easier for you to kind of create your designs and create a prototype essentially. So you now know exactly what designs you need to create. And that essentially is your day 3 and day 4. And day 5 then for you is essentially just find 5 people that you can test these prototypes out with. Take them through it, see whether or not it's working with them. Try to ask them questions which are not very leading to ensure that it's not like you kind of tell them that, is this the best design you've ever seen? You're not going to ask them that, right?
Are you mind blown by this design? Is this the best thing that you've ever seen in your entire life? That is probably not a great question, is what you're saying.
Exactly. Yeah. And one of the most common mistakes that people make in user research is they kind of ask them, would they use something that does this? Or would they use something that does this? Users will almost always, particularly if the feature is free, say yes. It doesn't matter whether they use it or not. What you're trying to do is kind of glancing at their behavior and trying to understand from their behavior as to whether it's a fit for them or not.
That makes sense. And we'll add a link to the show notes for those who are like interested in understanding what this process is. The user journey maps you mentioned is actually pretty fascinating. It actually, even just as you were saying it, thinking about it makes sense. So if folks are interested in like coming up with an application design or something, I imagine that's something that could be pretty useful. You said you studied like about different patterns, and can you talk about that process? Like, what were your findings? Like specifically on Android, did you find anything? Did you discover any patterns or usages when you have conducted these studies with Android users?
Yeah. So for the second half of 2016, I essentially did a lot of research in India with a demographic called the next billion users. It's not really a marketing term, though it comes across like that. Cisco has data pointing to an increase in internet users from about a billion from 2014 to 2019. And as you'd imagine, a lot of these users are in India itself, where internet penetration is pretty low, but it's picking up a lot. So the companies like Google and Facebook, for example, are kind of promoting this a lot of targeting these people, but they focus on the technical side of it. One of the things that I kind of realized was that these users have never really used a computer in their lives. The first computing device that they're using is going to be the smartphone that they probably pick up. So far, they've only ever really used a feature phone. So the goal of mine was to kind of test out a few different very common patterns that we have, which is essentially gestures, it is search, it's buttons, and it's swipes, and give these people very easy goals that they kind of have to do and test it out with prototypes whether or not it works with them. That's when I kind of realized, for example, the fact that search is something that these people have never used. They have no idea about. That's because since they've only been on feature phones, they've never really performed a search itself. So how I kind of recognized that was I kind of gave them a fairly standard looking dialer application, and I asked them to dial the number of a guy, of a contact starting with the letter R. And every user would kind of just scroll down trying to get to that instead of just tapping on the search icon right there in front of them itself. And then when you kind of talk to them about it, you kind of realize that they've never really gone through the concept of it. Another thing that they've never really done, for example, is horizontal swipes. Again, something that on Android in particular, we kind of take for granted with the top tabs itself. We kind of talk about how, hey, when the argument comes that top tabs versus bottom nav, we say that, hey, you just have to swipe to get to the next one. These people kind of aren't used to it. So even when they kind of figured out this is a tab interface, they would kind of tap on the ones on top instead of swipe through it. The buttons are a especially tricky one because, again, something that we take for granted is that people will understand the icons that we have in front of us itself. The thing is, icons are sometimes not really clear to the person itself. We kind of joke about how millennials have no clue that what the save icon is. They've never really seen a floppy disk, right? So these people have never really seen like a mouse in their lives and stuff like that. So communicating these things to them becomes even more challenging at that point. Simultaneously, the difficulty that you end up having is a lot of these people are illiterate, and that means that they can't even read their own regional language, or they can't read English. So if you haven't localized, they can't understand what you've put in there. So buttons in particular get very challenging for these people.
And these folks are still using phones today. They're using smartphones today, like even if they're not necessarily, they can't read necessarily the language.
No, so the people that I kind of researched with were specifically people who have never used a smartphone yet. They were people who were just about to, because they had kind of signed up to drive for Uber. And I had the opportunity to kind of go there and interview them before they got the smartphones itself. But even the first Uber, like when a person a lot of Uber drivers in India are new to a smartphone itself, and you can see how they're struggling with a lot of the interfaces. So, for example, I saw one Uber driver who was on his first day. He actually had missed out cash from his previous ride because he kind of canceled the ride by mistake at the end of it instead of actually ending it. And he kind of held on to me and saying that, can you please end this ride in front of you? So they have this button to end a ride where they have to kind of swipe across it, and he swipes across it. And then every next button that comes off, when it asks him to rate me, he's trying to swipe across to give me 5 stars instead of just tap on the 5th one. And then when it comes to submit, he's again swiping across that button instead of simply tapping on it.
Oh.
Wow, that's fascinating. So it's almost like in real time, he's training his model to understand how this interface works.
Yeah, but the thing that I kind of noticed is these people need very clear-cut affordances to make them understand what they need to do, because these buttons, like the swipe button in the beginning, just has this kind of like a slight color that kind of just comes across this rectangular button, and he didn't quite get that. And it's quite easily possible that in the bright sunlight, you can't even notice that glare going across. So he's been trained to swipe across, so he just keeps swiping across every button he sees.
Oh, wow.
Amazing.
I didn't even think about that. Following up quickly with something that you mentioned, and this is something I'm pretty sure everyone's interested. So you know how the swipeable tabs on top, and there's like the navigation drawer, and now we have Google has finally sort of added bottom tabs officially to the design as well, right? So you know where I'm going with this.
Right.
What are your thoughts on adding bottom tabs? Because this is something that comes up all the time, right?
Right. So it's one of those where it's I think I've come around to kind of accept them. I can't say that I'm the the bottom nav is something that I've kind of warmed up to recently. It kind of makes sense if you have a hamburger menu and you have options hidden in there. Ultimately, that's been the entire goal of the bottom nav currently as per the material guidelines itself. One of the major reasons for it, and people talk about why can't these just be on top, and I've been someone who has asked that. I think the point more than anything is the fact that the devices are really getting bigger, right? So now we're at a point where the average device is above 5 inches, and it gets really difficult for a user to reach the top. So in that sense, I'm kind of okay with it. I do think that you shouldn't just be I have to add a bottom nav because it's the flavor of the season.
So are there any interesting quirks or differences in behavior that you noticed? For example, you mentioned when you did your user research, right? Besides, you mentioned, I know from your presentation, and we should briefly talk about this as well, because I believe this was at DroidCon NYC where you talked about designing for the next billion.
Yep.
Right. So designing for the next billion, you brought that up, right? What are some interesting quirks or differences in behavior that you've noticed, or your research in giving this presentation? And you also mentioned that you did some studies for folks who are going to sign up to be an Uber driver, right? Were there any interesting quirks or differences that you think that we take for granted as Android developers that probably should be highlighted?
Yeah. So I think as an Android developer, the big thing that you have to keep in mind is that a lot of these users do not download your applications from Google Play. And I don't necessarily mean that they pirate your stuff, even a free application. Even free applications, they tend to get it from Bluetooth from their friends. So there are a few applications over here called Zender and Share It, which are really popular, which essentially just allow you to rip out the APK of your current application and share it over Bluetooth or a local Wi-Fi with someone else. I came across this.
Yeah, that disturbs me at so many levels.
Yes. So I came across this when there was this person at, like, I talked about this messaging application that I worked at, and when one of those users was complaining about the fact that he's not able to receive the messages, and I kind of asked him which device is he on, and he was on a Nokia X, and I'm like,
Oh,
how did you get it? Because we only put it on Google Play, and the app requires Play services, and
yeah.
I mean,
so that's when that's when I came across it.
And so how does this happen again? How are they getting the apps?
So these Zender or Share It essentially just allow you to kind of just rip out an APK of an app that you have installed, and you can just keep sharing it across.
So I can kind of, I just walk up to you and I guess we have, is that an app that's installed or something like that? And then it kind of helps us transfer the app between, just like near field or Bluetooth or whatever?
Yep. So it's
oh, wow.
It's just over. I think it establishes a connection over Bluetooth, like nearby APIs or something like that, and just does it over like a local Wi-Fi then.
So that's a completely normal thing over in that region, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. So India's a complicated market. Apparently, like I don't have data, like a data point to back this up, but a few people have pointed out to me the fact that Chrome only has like a 50% market share on mobile browsers in India, despite the fact that Android itself has like 90 to 95% market share in India.
Wow. So what other browser do you think these folks would be using?
So there's this browser called UC browser that is very popular over here.
UC browser?
Yeah. So its essential goal has been primarily to boost like data saving more than anything else, because ultimately a lot of people are on 2G and even 3G connections, but they are on very small packs of like maybe just 300 megabytes a month.
Oh, wow. Okay. I do know Opera had an app also that they called Opera Turbo or something, where like essentially the goal was to like minimize the data usage, right?
Yeah. I used to use Opera Mini back in the Nokia days. I think it's still around, but UC browser has really taken the market right now.
The other thing you mentioned just like scares me though, because sharing of applications like APKs, well, I mean, I imagine that there's like it somehow figures out like the architecture, because like, I mean, like what if it's like an ARM architecture, so they're different like altogether, like somehow that is managed. Like what if it was built specifically for just like one architecture? Like that boggles my mind. Maybe the app, I imagine, like accounts for that. The other thing is, well, I mean, Play services you mentioned, that's another problem. The other thing is, well, I mean, I imagine these are rooted phones, because otherwise how do they just like pull off the APKs? And then do they pull off APKs from, because this is like an external APK, it's not like their own application, right? So I imagine there's like, this just like, my mind's already hurting thinking about this problem.
And I'm just gonna make it worse for you by pointing out that users in India, as a result of it gets worse because users in India do not tend to update their apps as quickly as you would expect, right? So once you put an app out there, it's going to probably stay around for a very long time, installed on these people's devices. So
and shared across multiple devices. So wow,
so
compounds.
Be very careful of what you push out,
folks. No bugs, zero bugs, always
0.0. Now, there's so many folks, out there when we talk about the next billion, and I'm just going to stick to the region in India, which is where you have a lot of experience. For folks out there, what kind of devices do they mainly have? What, if you had to guess, I'm not looking for an exact data point here. If you had to guess, how many folks are using like a smartphone versus a regular old feature phone nowadays?
If I remember correctly, the number's about 30 million smartphone users now in India. I'll try to find it out and share it with you guys separately. The Internet Association from over here kind of points out to about 400 million internet users in India. A lot of us don't believe that to be true. Like Facebook shared some data recently talking about 170 million users in India, and I think the number is probably going to be like 250 million or something like that. But what could be happening is like these people are like internet users, but very, very infrequent users itself.
Right.
So now if I'm designing an application and I'm taking into consideration, these next billion users and, all these things that you're talking about, from folks from just swiping buttons because they're still learning to, basically people getting introduced to mobile phones in general, what's maybe the lowest common denominator that I should be designing for? Is there any tips and tricks that you can provide to developers so that they can actually can give their app the best chance of being user friendly to new users in that next billion?
Yeah. So I think the thing is that a lot of us try to take this pride in the fact that we don't want any tutorials in our application, like we don't want any coach marks and stuff like that. You kind of want to go away from that and realize that these people kind of are trying to pick up the design of your application itself. And especially, for example, if you're using gestures, something that might seem easy to you is probably not the case to other people, even people who have regularly used smartphones previously, right? So providing menus and like suggestions and stuff like that helps. But of course, that also means that you don't just do like one go and do it all together. What I've found, like from my limited tests for tutorials so far, what I found is that when tutorials are done in context, it really helps. And what you kind of want to do is design your application in a way where it kind of promotes them to perform a certain action in the first try itself. So, for example, there's this application in India called PhonePe, which is it's a new application for transferring money from your bank account to another person's bank account using a pretty popular new framework over here called UPI. What they're trying to do is to promote people to at least make the first transaction, because getting them to use their phones for banking is pretty new here. They're saying that even if you transfer just 1 rupee, we're going to give you 50 rupees of cash back. A lot of people are doing that just to get that cash back right now itself. But the huge power of it is it gets them to realize how simple it is to actually just do this, right? And once someone experiences your application this way, it kind of gets them, like, it gives you a better chance to bring them in the next time.
Right. They're betting on the convenience being the thing that just wins them over eventually, right?
Exactly. And this other side of it is, of course, the fact that it means it's essentially going into the old Dropbox referral system kind of thing, right? You're not spending money on user acquisition on something like a Facebook ad or something else. You're just giving it to the users itself.
So a quick follow-up question to that. So you mentioned that you, in order to maintain that high level of quality user, like sometimes you do need like in-app tutorials and you sort of like need this wizard-like interface, right? So is there like any examples that you've seen that of applications that sort of like do that pretty well? Like you mentioned the Pay mobile app. Is there any other apps that you think you can point our users to?
So the problem is, like, most of the applications, like I can point out to the ones that do this really bad, which is like the ones that kind of just give you all of them right in the beginning, and I'm just blindly just skipping right through them, right?
Oh, so that's a great point. So that's like one reason why it didn't necessarily work previously, because if I think of the simplest implementation, and this is something that most folks call like a new user experience, right? Like it's like the Nux thing. That's like the term used. Like I know usually the simplest way to implement this is like, well, just store in your shared preferences, and if it's not been activated before, then boom, just like load this new user experience. And then what's going to happen if it's a new device? Essentially, you're going to have like 4 of these new user experiences that are just going to pop up one after the other. So like you mentioned, a good way would be to actually provide it with context, right? So when the folks actually do use that feature, that's when you pop it up for the first time and like sort of train that model.
Yeah. So one that I can think of, like, it's not really coaching itself, but this is something that's essentially called activation, where you're trying to get your user to get the real power of your app. Twitter does this pretty well, where they're trying to get a lot of the new users to follow a lot of accounts in the beginning, because they've kind of determined the fact that when people follow a lot of users, they kind of stay engaged for longer, right? Previously, they would push up certain accounts itself. Now what they kind of do is they try to make you point out what your interests are and try to make you follow accounts based on that itself, like a bunch of accounts together. It's not really coaching, but it actually is kind of already gets you committed, like gets a user to invest in your application early on.
Right. And actually that is a better definition of what a new user experience would be, right? Like how you get the new user to sort of like get your product.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we touched on, like, for the next billion users, where like what are like some, Don asked, what are like some things that we can like be conscious of for good design. Stepping back a little from just the next billion, right? Because like you're a designer and we have this opportunity to actually talk with someone who understands both engineering and design, what are some common trends that you find today? Like what are some common design trends that you think work well? And I mean, even if there are some design trends you think that don't work well, like maybe you can let us know, because many a time what we have noticed with as being Android developers is a lot of like the design aesthetic is suggested by the developers themselves, right? Because most designers tend to be iOS focused, like iOS first, like that's just the nature of how things started. So many a time I've found that many of the suggestions for Android applications come from the engineers themselves. So what are some design trends that you think would work well, currently work well, and some things that we should be aware of?
Yeah. So on Android in particular, like a good material design app is a given at this point, right? Like users now expect it, and you kind of have to meet the guidelines to have an application that does even half decently. A new trend that's been taking over this year is something called complexion reduction. And it talks about how the focus of this is essentially to reduce as much complexity from an interface as possible. And when I talk about that, it essentially means a lot more white spaces, taking away a lot more color. This tends to mean a lot more line icons and stuff like that. And the point of it is like just get straight to the content itself. It's used by some applications like Instagram. It's used by Medium. It's used by Uber now. And it works really well because what then happens is like the point where they kind of really want you to focus, like the meat of the stuff is where most of the color and other stuff really lies. So it pulls your attention over there as a user. Human beings have this desire to just completely reduce the complexity of anything that they see to its bare minimum. And this kind of fits in right in over there.
Interesting. And so would you say this is similar? Because I know iOS, maybe in iOS 7 or something, they sort of like tailored down the whole flat design where everything was just a line or a box, right? This is a little different from that.
Right. So so flat UI essentially means like you're essentially not having a Z index, right?
Oh, right. Okay.
You might have like a fake depth in the sense of like users might perceive a certain background and a certain foreground, but you're essentially just completely flat. Complexion reduction does not talk about that. You can still have your drop shadows, but you're going to use them a lot more carefully. So for example, like you would probably not want a card UI, like the shadows in a simple list view, for example, right? That just adds color on your screen where it doesn't need to be.
Right. As engineers, as Android developers, you don't necessarily get the time to think about these things in such detail. So
right.
This is super helpful. Thank you so much, Raveesh.
You're welcome.
So if folks want to reach out to you and maybe throw in like some more Android developer questions, what's basically the best way they can do that?
You can just reach out to me on Twitter. I'm at Raveesh Bhalla.
Excellent. And if folks want to draw out of your startup experience and all the wicked designs you've been working on, Don, how do they do that?
You can reach me at Kaushik Gopal on Twitter.
Well done.
Actually, no. You can reach me at Don Felker. And so on Twitter, that'd be the best way. But Kaushik, how do the folks get a hold of you and your wicked design skills?
Well, I don't know about wicked design skills, but if you want to reach out to me, Kaushik Gopal on Twitter is usually the best way. So if you have any questions, then that would be a good place to shoot that. And our Twitter handle for the podcast is Fragmented Cast. And all the links to the different applications that Raveesh mentioned and some of the articles that he mentioned, we'll add all of those into the show notes, which you can find at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thank you, folks, for listening. And thank you again so much, Raveesh, for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Once again, we'd like to thank our sponsor for this week, and that sponsor is BuddyBuild. Now remember, BuddyBuild is a mobile-optimized continuous integration and delivery platform that was built specifically to help you, the developer, engage your end users during the entire software development lifecycle. Check them out at fragmentedpodcast.com/BuddyBuild. Again, that's fragmentedpodcast.com/BuddyBuild. Thanks again.
That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Don Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit all of the Fragmented episodes ourselves. The amazing Sarah from Spec helps us with production assistance and wraps our final mix. Our theme music and ad music is produced by the cool cat, Alan Taylor. You can find more episodes of the show on Pocket Casts, Google Play Music, or any of the other great podcast players in town. Our website is fragmentedpodcast.com, and you can find the links to all the stuff we say on our website. Thank you all for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.